My name is Avraham and I will be discussing my research today on student-led discussion. So for a background, I was in a 5th grade classroom at the Jewish Community Day School of Boston, and I had a class of 26 kids that was split into 2 groups of 13. And most of this discussion unit happened during a literary unit about Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which is a historical fiction novel about the South in the 1930s. I observed during discussion that my students were extremely engaged and willing to share their ideas. But unfortunately, they had no problem sharing their ideas simultaneously over each other, yelling and talking, and there was no real communication skills, and their ideas were not connected to each other. So what I said had nothing to do with what the next student said. So this brought me to my inquiry questions. How can I create productive and safe open discussion in my classroom? And what methods or processes can I set up or teach to my students to help them talk to each other in a way that promotes understanding and growth of ideas? So I began work on a concept called open discussion, an open discussion curriculum, and I am defining for today open discussion as student-led discussion where norms and behavioral expectations are enforced by the students without my facilitation or very little part of my facilitation, that students speak to each other when they want to or when they don't want to without me calling on them, and that their ideas sort of build off of each other, that they don't sort of just say what they want to say and then remove themselves from the conversation. So this started when we did, my students and I, as we began to come up with language to discuss some of the things that were becoming detrimental to our discussion. And these language components fell into 2 categories: talk moves and terminology. Talk moves are what we defined as phrases that students could say or do to each other in the middle of discussion. So verbalization techniques that they could add on or introduce in part of their sentence to allow them to communicate with each other. During small group discussion, they would have this talk moves checklist, and they would check to identify whether or not they used a particular move. And then I collected the data. The other set of language are basically potential pitfall terminology. And these were basically things that we saw happening in the classroom and that we wanted to identify in a particular term so that we could help us deal with it. For today, I'm really going to be focusing a lot on ping pong, and ping pong is the term that we use to express when 1 to 2 or 3 students are just going back and forth, and no one else is getting into the conversation, like ping pong. So literature units followed the same routine. Students responded to prompts in writing, then they participated in small group discussion, and then they moved to full class open discussion. I introduced every single one of the terminology or talk moves during a modified version of the small group protocol. There was an established protocol, and depending on whether or not I wanted to work on a particular talk move or a particular pitfall, I would modify the routine to allow students to practice just that one. So I first began to do some analysis, and I realized that there was a slight increase in average use of talk moves in small group discussion, starting at around a little bit over 3.5, and coming and sort of ending at a little bit under 6. But while this was happening, I also did some analysis on full group discussion and realized that talk moves were dramatically stopping to be used. But at the same time, I felt that discussion was becoming more open. And that sort of confused me, and I didn't know what to do. So I needed to create some sort of rubric or analysis to come to the conclusion of whether or not the discussion was getting better, or that it was just in my head and I wanted it to get better. So I started to read James T. Dillon's Using Discussion in Classroom. He puts discussions into a variety of different principles, and the one that just sort of really connected to me was his moral principles. Many of my talk moves or potential pitfalls terminology fell into other versions of his principles, but the moral principles were really the goal that I was trying to target. And these are 6 sort of subsets of Dylan's moral principles. So what I needed to do is, using his principles and my version of what I wanted, I had to create a rubric on how to actually decide if a discussion was improving. So I created a rubric with 8 different principles, and each one of these principles could fall into limiting, approaching, or open levels of discussion. This is what the 8 principles are: predominant speaker, continuation of thought, chain thought, peace and order, freedom, challenge, equality, and question. For the sake of today, I'm going to focus on what open level discussion looks like for 4 of these principles, which is peace and order, where students are always observing the rules that facilitate exchange. They don't interrupt, they don't raise voices. And freedom, students are not prevented from verbally participating or not verbally participating, but in some way they show that they are a member of this community of inquiry. Students use proper tone, they use the talk moves that we have been working on, and student participation is not affected whether or not I disagree with you. So they don't shut down whether they agree or disagree. And then equality is that student verbal participation was a vast majority of the class without a single student speaking a large chunk of the time. So then I took this rubric and I noticed that I wanted to start and do some analysis of certain discussions. And one particular discussion jumped out at me in my statistics because there was an enormous jump in talk moves in full class discussion, and I wanted to see what actually happened. So I'm going to set up this clip. This is 2 students will engage in ping pong, and the concept has not been brought up to them before. And this is a very, very short clip of an extended period, extended ping pong event.
Middle ground is where they have mixed feelings about each other, and they are all at the same time, not one at a time, as like they are here. Because TJ, first they're getting along fine, and then TJ does something, and boom, they hate each other. Then TJ does something, and it's fine.
Because even at the beginning, when they were being friends with each other, Stacy still didn't, Cassie still didn't really like him. Like, he still did some things that he didn't like, but they were still friends.
I'm talking about Stacy and TJ, not.
Yeah, no, they're always friends. I mean, they're always some feeling of friendship, but there was always at least some feeling of dislike between them.
No.
Yes. Show me in the text where Stacy ever fully likes TJ, or where Stacy's not sympathetic. Like in the book, like Papa says, like, I'm sorry to see him turning like that. That means that he doesn't want him to be turning, which means that he still kind of wants him to be their friend. So he's like sympathetic to them.
Yeah, you're bringing in other people. I'm explaining.
No, Stacy, but Stacy does too. Stacy doesn't.
So as you can see, this discussion was limiting freedom and equality principle, and there was a real decrease in peace and order. You saw, talk moves were not being used effectively. One student in the dark hat comes in and kind of gets bulldozed through. So I, at this point, stopped the entire conversation, and I introduced the concept of ping pong for the first time. At this point, as soon as I stopped and introduced ping pong, 4 new students speak immediately that hadn't spoken before. And then when ping pong started up again between 3 students, I stopped and brought up a concept that we had been working on called step up, step back, where students sort of diagnose exactly whether they've been verbally participating at a high amount or low amount and self-rating. I then decided that I was going to do some analysis of the next discussion, both by myself and with my peers in my cohort, to see if there was going to be any change in the following discussion. The following discussion, we practiced the concept of ping pong in small group, and then I gave a verbal reminder to students when we started our full class discussion. So if you look at the first class discussion, which is on the very top, you'll notice that in the giant green and yellow chunks, that those two students that were ping-ponging, actually they dominated over 50%, both in talk terms and in the amount of time that they spoke. And that really sort of hurt the equality and did not allow other students to get involved. While in the second discussion, both the two students that ping-ponged, one spoke the most times, but was only 5th in longevity, and the other one spoke only 3 times, but actually spoke 4/3 in longevity. So it showed to me that students internalized the concept, but did not remove themselves from the conversation because of they had been reproached or filmed. So this led me to 2 findings. The first one is that giving students language to speak and teaching them discussion principles improves student-led discussion of literature units or literature in general, and move them towards a more open level. I believe that the language is a scaffolding process, is that once students begin to understand the principles behind them, that they were able to partake in open discussion without using the specific language of the talk. And my other finding is that my rubric now gives me a step back to analyze whether or not my talk moves or my activities are actually improving the principles that I see in my discussion. And that I now have an overall, very detailed, specific determination of what makes open discussion and what I'm aiming for. And I can now, in the future, decide how I'm going to pinpoint or how I'm going to target one of these 8 principles and the different methods that I can use or try to use. Thank you.